Why the US is still beating China in GDP. For more than a century, the United States has been the world's leading economic power, built on innovation, hard work, and a relentless drive to grow. But over the past few decades, one nation has risen to challenge that position like never before: China. As we enter 2025, many still ask, is America about to be overtaken? The numbers tell a different story. Despite China's massive population and manufacturing might, the US economy remains number one, and it may stay that way for much longer than many expected. To understand why America still leads and what that really means, we need to look closer at the number that defines economic power around the world: GDP. Chapter 1: What is GDP? Gross Domestic Product, or GDP, measures the total value of all goods and services produced within a country in a given year. Economists track it every 3 months, but the annual total shows the real size of an economy. It's the main way economists compare the size and health of different countries. GDP only includes paid economic activity. It leaves out unpaid work such as caring for family members or volunteering, which still benefits society. It also doesn't show whether people are healthy, happy, or if wealth is shared fairly. So, while GDP can rise, that doesn't always mean life is getting better for everyone. So how is GDP actually calculated? Economists measure it in 3 ways: the production approach, the expenditure approach, and the income approach. The production approach measures everything a country produces, the total value of goods and services made, usually expressed in a common currency, like the US dollar. The expenditure approach measures everything people, businesses, and the government spend. And the income approach measures everything workers and companies earn. Each approach looks at the economy from a different angle, but in theory, they should all give the same final GDP number, since they're measuring the same activity in 3 different ways. The expenditure approach is the most common method used to calculate GDP around the world. And this is the equation used to measure GDP using the expenditure approach. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X M. Together, these parts: total consumer spending, C; total business investment or spending, I; total government spending, G; and total net exports, X, M, which means total exports minus total imports, form the foundation of the expenditure approach, giving us the total value of everything produced and spent in the country each year. In the end, all that spending within a country reflects everything it produces, because every dollar spent on a product or service, there is a dollar earned by the person or business that created it there. For example, when the US government builds new highways or funds a public school, that's government spending. It increases GDP. When businesses build new factories or buy new machines, that's business investment, the money companies spend to expand or improve their production. And then there's trade, what a country sells to others and what it buys from them. Exports are the goods and services America sells to other countries, like aircraft, soybeans, or software. Exports bring money into the US economy, so they add to GDP. Imports are the goods and services America buys from abroad, like electronics, clothing, or toys from other countries. Imports send money out of the US, so they are subtracted when calculating GDP. These are just examples of the kinds of spending that count toward GDP. Altogether, all the spending by consumers, businesses, and the government makes up a country's total GDP. And when we compare America's GDP to China's, we're comparing the total value of everything each nation makes, sells, and consumes, the clearest snapshot of their real economic power. And no country showed that power better than America, long before China's rise. Chapter 2: Before China, America was the world's factory. Before China became the world's factory, that title belonged to the United States. After World War II, America produced over half of all manufactured goods in the world. But as labor costs rose and globalization expanded, meaning trade barriers fell, transportation became cheaper and companies could source parts and labor from around the world. Many began moving production overseas, paving the way for China's rise. This shift, often called the China shock, hit hard in the 2000s. In towns across America's industrial heartland, the hum of factory machines fell silent. Once busy plants that had built cars, steel, and furniture for generations shut their doors. In Ohio or Michigan, factories that once built cars closed. Millions of workers lost their jobs almost overnight, as cheaper Chinese goods flooded store shelves and global markets. As paychecks dried up for many Americans, small businesses closed too: diners, hardware stores, and local shops, because with fewer steady incomes, local spending collapsed. Once bustling main streets grew quiet and empty, their darkened storefronts reflecting an economy that had moved overseas. Entire communities were left wondering if America's great manufacturing era had come to an end. But there were pros too. While factory towns across the U.S. struggled, store shelves filled with cheaper products, clothes, electronics, and everyday goods made in China that many American families could now afford. In cities like Seattle, Austin, and San Francisco, a new kind of economy rose, powered not by assembly lines, but by ideas. Entrepreneurs built startups in garages, coders wrote software that reached the world, and engineers designed the next generation of technology. The U.S. economy adapted, shifting its strength from low-cost manufacturing to innovation and technology, and despite the pain, America endured, proving that resilience and reinvention were its greatest strengths. And today, the U.S. has a much larger service sector than China, which is normal for advanced economies. It marks a transformation from building physical goods to creating ideas, technology, and high-value services, the next stage of economic maturity, when a country's growth depends less on factories and more on knowledge, creativity, and skilled workers. As America reinvented itself through innovation, China seized the moment, turning its vast labor force into the engine of global manufacturing. And that's what the next chapter is about. Chapter 3, China, the world's manufacturing factory. China's economic rise began after market reforms in 1978, led by Deng Xiaoping, who was China's leader after Mao Zedong. These reforms marked China's shift away from a fully state-controlled system to one that allowed private businesses, foreign investment, and competition. Farmers could sell their own crops, factories could make profits, and foreign companies were invited to set up joint ventures, kick-starting decades of rapid industrial growth. That momentum accelerated when China joined the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2001, an international group that sets the rules for global trade and helps countries trade goods and services more freely with one another. Joining the WTO meant China lowered its tariffs and trade barriers, making it easier to sell goods abroad or bring in the materials and technology it needed to build them from other countries. By opening up to global trade, Chinese factories gained access to cheaper inputs, like raw materials, components, and machinery from other countries, which helped them produce goods faster and at lower cost. Within just a few years, China's factories were exporting electronics, textiles, and machinery to every corner of the world, transforming it into the largest exporter on Earth. But every boom has a price, and China's came from the people who built it. Millions of migrant workers labored long hours, often 60 to 70 hours a week, for low pay and minimal rights, powering China's rise through the 2000s. In southern China, a young factory worker named Li Mei left her village to work on an assembly line, building smartphones for export. She earned just a few $100s a month, sending most of it home to support her family. Like millions of others, she lived in a crowded dorm, worked 6 days a week, and rarely saw her children. This low-cost labor built China's manufacturing dominance, but also highlighted deep inequality. By the 2010s, manufacturing made up over 40% of China's GDP, producing nearly 30% of the world's goods. Yet today, Chinese wages and production costs are rising. U.S. tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods like those bought into the U.S. from China, have made everything from electronics to furniture more expensive for American consumers. And since it's more expensive for U.S. businesses to buy these imported goods or parts, they often raise their own prices to cover the higher costs, making many everyday items more expensive for American consumers. All of this pushed global giants like Apple, Samsung, and Nike to shift production to lower-cost countries, especially after the pandemic, which began in China in late 2019, exposed how risky it was to depend so heavily on one place. With China holding the largest share of global manufacturing, its lockdown sent shockwaves worldwide. Factories stalled, shelves emptied, and the world saw just how fragile its supply chains really were. Many companies are moving their factories to countries like India, Vietnam, and Mexico, where labor is cheaper, trade access is improving, and governments offer incentives to attract manufacturers. One U.S. electronics company, for example, split its China assembly line into new plants in Vietnam and Mexico to cut costs and avoid future trade tensions between the U.S. and China. These tensions often come from the U.S. government, which has placed tariffs and restrictions on Chinese goods, and from China's government, which can respond with its own trade limits or regulations. By producing in other countries, the company reduces the risk of getting caught in future disputes or policy changes from either side. In response, China is trying to reinvent its economy, shifting from low-cost manufacturing to high-tech industries that create more value. The Chinese government is pouring billions into sectors like electric vehicles, semiconductors, robotics, and renewable energy, hoping Chinese companies can invent and build advanced technologies instead of just assembling products designed elsewhere. But this transformation is difficult. High-tech production requires research, skilled workers, and open access to global innovation, areas where China still lags behind. At the same time, Western countries, especially the United States, are limiting China's access to critical components like AI chips and advanced semiconductors, slowing its progress. It marks a new era of economic rivalry, one driven less by cheap labor and more by innovation, technology, and the race to lead the industries of the future. China's industrial rise transformed the world, but no miracle lasts forever. The same forces that fueled its growth are now weighing it down. And that's where the next chapter begins. Chapter 4: China's economic slowdown, the end of the boom. China's economy is still growing, but far slower than before. For nearly 4 decades, it expanded at an average of 8 to 10% a year, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty and transforming one of the poorest countries in the world into a global powerhouse. Today, growth has cooled to around 4 to 5%, weighed down by 4 major challenges: mounting debt, an aging population, weak consumer spending, and a property market running out of steam. Debt is one of China's biggest burdens. For years, local governments and property developers, companies that buy land, build housing, and sell it for profit, borrowed heavily to fund massive construction projects, mostly from state-owned banks, private investors, or firms that lend money outside the regular banking system, and by selling bonds, which are promises to repay loans to investors later with interest. It worked while the boom lasted, when millions were leaving rural villages for city jobs and new apartments. But as China's population aged, birth rates fell, and job growth slowed, that wave of migration began to fade. Many of those projects, highways, stadiums, and industrial parks, were left without enough people or businesses to sustain them. Now, across China, half-empty developments stand silent, reminders of an era built on borrowed growth. In smaller cities, factory slowdowns and dependence on construction have left incomes low and jobs scarce. Population growth has stalled, and young families are buying fewer homes. The result is visible across China: rows of empty apartment towers, their windows dark at night. For millions, those dark windows aren't just empty homes, they're years of savings trapped in concrete. For years, China's property market looked unstoppable. Developers borrowed heavily to buy land and build new apartments, confident that prices would keep rising. Families, too, rushed to buy homes, not just to live in, but as investments, often purchasing second or even third apartments, believing they could always sell them later for a profit. But this frenzy created a housing bubble when prices rise far beyond what most people can actually afford, driven by speculation rather than real demand. Apartments in many cities sold for 30 to 40 times the average worker's annual income, and yet developers kept building, even as fewer young people were forming new households. Soon, supply outpaced demand. Empty towers rose faster than buyers could fill them, and once prices climbed too high, new buyers began to disappear. As demand weakened, developers started cutting prices to attract buyers, which made others wait for even lower prices. Confidence cracked, sales plunged, and what was once the engine of China's growth turned into one of its biggest risks. And no company showed that risk more clearly than the one that built China's dream and then watched it collapse. The clearest example of this collapse is Evergrande, once China's largest property developer. For years, It borrowed massive sums to buy land and launch new projects, selling apartments before construction even began. The company used money from new buyers to finish older projects, betting that prices would always rise. Then the Chinese government introduced the Three Red Lines policy to stop developers from borrowing too much. This made it hard for companies like Evergrande to get new loans. At the same time, home sales slowed because prices were too high for most families. People began to lose confidence in the housing market. With less money coming in and no way to borrow more, Evergrande quickly ran out of cash. Construction froze across hundreds of sites, leaving millions of unfinished apartments and families who had paid deposits with nothing to show for it. By 2021, it defaulted on over $300 billion in debt, turning China's housing boom into a cautionary tale of what happens when growth relies on endless borrowing. Moreover, in China, wages have stagnated and youth unemployment has soared. Many factories have automated or moved from China to lower-cost countries like Vietnam and India. At the same time, the Chinese government has introduced tighter rules on tech and education firms to curb monopolies, reduce inequality, and protect data privacy. A monopoly is when one company becomes so large that it controls an entire market, making it hard for other businesses to compete and limiting consumers' choices. With fewer jobs and weaker confidence, families are saving instead of spending, dragging China's economic growth down even further. At the same time, China's population is aging fast. By 2030, 1 in 4 Chinese citizens will be over 60. Fewer Chinese young workers are entering the labor force while pension and healthcare costs surge, straining finances of everyone including the government and weakening demand of goods and services. Meanwhile, America's economy grows slower but steadier. While China's boom ran on construction and debt, America's strength comes from people and progress. Consumer spending makes up nearly 70% of U.S. GDP, powered by everyday purchases, small businesses, and innovation. It's an economy driven less by borrowing and more by confidence, creativity, and demand, a slower climb, but a stronger foundation. Because in the long run, it's not the fastest growth that wins, it's the growth that lasts. China's momentum is stalling, its old engines running out of fuel. Across the Pacific, the United States moves differently, slower, steadier, powered by innovation, not debt. And that's the story ahead. Chapter 5, Why the US is still ahead. America doesn't just grow, it reinvents itself. Every major leap, from the internet to artificial intelligence, began in the US before spreading across the world. In America, ideas don't wait for permission. Anyone can turn a sketch, a code, or a late-night thought into a company, and that freedom to experiment is what keeps the economy alive. It's messy, it's risky, but it works. In China, growth often starts with a plan, big, fast, and coordinated from the top. It builds cities overnight and factories by the hundreds. But in the US, growth starts with curiosity, a spark in someone's garage, a startup in a dorm room, and those sparks often turn into industries that change everything. American workers now produce up to 6 times more value than the average Chinese worker, not because they work longer, but because technology, automation, and data amplify every hour they spend. A single coder, designer, or engineer can create value, once possible only for factories of hundreds. At the same time, China's workforce is aging much faster than America's. By the 2030s, China is expected to spend more on pensions and healthcare than on innovation, while the US keeps more people working, inventing, and investing in the future. Chinese workers also retire earlier, often between 50 and 60, while many Americans work into their mid-60s. That extra decade of experience and income keeps the US labor force larger, more skilled, and more productive. And while China's graduates are struggling, with nearly 1 in 5 unable to find work, America's college-educated unemployment rate sits around 5%, less than a third of that. It's a clear sign of how flexible and opportunity-driven the U.S. job market remains, especially in fast-growing industries like AI, tech, and healthcare. The U.S. also has far more white-collar, high-skilled jobs, engineers, analysts, developers, while China still relies heavily on blue-collar factory work. That difference shapes the entire economy. America builds ideas, China builds the machines that make them. And as new industries rise, AI, clean energy, biotechnology, America is already leading the charge. Billions are pouring into chip factories in Arizona, AI labs in California, and clean tech startups across Texas. Economists say this innovation wave could add up to $4 trillion to US GDP within a decade, the biggest boost since the internet boom. Jeff Bezos started the Amazon giant by selling books from his garage, a simple idea that grew into the world's largest online marketplace, changing how billions of people shop and businesses sell. Mark Zuckerberg built Facebook, a new way for the world to connect from his college dorm. Elon Musk turned bold ideas about cars and space into Tesla and SpaceX, industries that reshaped the future. In America, visionaries like them didn't wait for permission. They built the impossible, and in doing so, they built an economy driven by imagination. Because in the end, that's America's real engine, not just technology or size, but the freedom to imagine, to fail, and to try again until something incredible works. And for now, no one does that quite like America. Imagination built the empire, but numbers decide the winner. So when it comes to economic power, the question isn't who dreams bigger, it's who delivers more. Time to find out. Chapter 6. Comparing GDPs of the US and China. After all the stories, China's rise, America's reinvention, the real question comes down to one number, GDP. It's the scoreboard of global power, the value of everything a nation builds, buys, and creates. So, dollar for dollar, who's really on top, the US or China? This can be done in two main ways. The first is by market exchange rates. That's the actual rate you'd get if you exchanged the Chinese yuan for the US dollar in the foreign exchange market. It shows how much China's currency is really worth in global trade. The second method is called purchasing power parity, or PPP. PPP shows how far people's local income really goes, what they can buy at home with the money they earn in their own currency. It's based on a simple idea. Money doesn't have the same buying power everywhere. In the US, $10 might buy one meal at a diner, but in China, that same $10, when converted into yuan, could buy 3 full meals. That's because prices for food, rent, and services are often lower in China, so each yuan buys more than $1 would in the US. PPP helps account for these differences. It adjusts for local prices to show what people can really afford with their earnings in their country, not just what their money is worth when exchanged into US dollars. Economists do this by comparing thousands of prices across countries, things like groceries, clothing, utilities, and rent, to see how much local currency equals $1 US in real buying power. For example, if a basket of everyday items costs $100 in the US but only 200 yuan in China, the PPP exchange rate would be $1 equals 2 yuan, because both amounts buy the same basket of goods. In short, PPP reveals the real size of an economy by showing what life actually costs inside it, how far people's money truly goes. Of course, I can't personally calculate GDP. That takes millions of data points from across entire economies, so these numbers come from global institutions like the IMF and World Bank. And when we look at the numbers for 2025, the gap remains clear. The United States GDP stands at roughly $28 trillion, while China's is around $18.5 trillion when measured by market exchange rates, meaning by converting China's yuan into US dollars. Even when adjusted for purchasing power parity, which makes China's economy look larger, the US still leads in overall wealth, productivity, and innovation. Closing message: the race for the future. For now, the United States still leads. Its economy is larger, more innovative, and more productive than China's. But history teaches us that no empire stays on top forever. Not the British, not the Romans, not anyone. China's ambitions remain vast, and its transformation is far from over. The future may not belong to one single superpower, but to many nations sharing influence, a multipolar world where the US, China, and others each shape global progress in their own way. Who dominates next is uncertain, but one thing is clear. The race for economic power is no longer about size alone. It's about resilience, innovation, and how each nation builds the future. Thank you for watching, and subscribe for more videos like this.